Hello and welcome to Lore of the Known Universe Episode 1. This episode will be an introduction and general background to the setting, so let's just jump right in. The topics we'll be discussing in this episode overall will be a general setting-wide information, which will be Part 1. The second and third parts will be a short summary of various nations, going over basically all of the major players in the known universe. And finally, I'll be doing a fourth part, which is the summary of key events in the history of the known universe. Talking about general information, the major topics we're going to cover are listed on screen here, but roughly we're going to talk about the cosmology, or the different realms of existence, planes that the gods inhabit, etc. We're going to discuss the types of faster-than-light travel, the speed at which information travels throughout the setting as influenced by faster-than-light travel, and how you send messages throughout the setting, what void blades are, and just sort of different types of those briefly, an introduction to artificial intelligence and robotics in the setting, and sort of how those fit in, the types of fuel used in the setting, the way time is handled, just so there's a rough understanding of that, because it is somewhat important, even if it's not relevant to what we talk about a lot in Traveler. The Suki Corridor, where all of my games in Traveler lately have been taking place. And then finally, just a generic sort of view of all the different galaxies in the known universe that are currently inhabited by human species that I'm discussing. The first area to look at is Cosmology, and there are 5 major planes of existence, and they are in the order that they were sort of discovered, but also the order in which they were actually created more accurately. We have the Void, which is the realm or plane of energy. It is the highest of the planes, according to Witcher cosmology, and is the first plane to have been created, the second plane encountered by humanity, the first being the material plane where we live. The Void is where gods themselves operate as we'd think of them. It's where sort of all energy and creation and matter comes from, but it's importantly not where souls come from. I'll get to that in a moment, but it is more or less just where gods exist, kind of Mount Olympus, if Mount Olympus was a realm. It's overseen by the Emperor of the Gods, who goes more commonly by the God Supreme. The second plane of existence is the Abyss. This is the opposite of the Void. It is the realm of destruction and decay, chaos, all those good things. If the Void is energy and creation, the Abyss is destruction and death, etc. It's also where daemons come from, those being essentially sort of not corrupted gods, more like creatures intent on causing chaos and destruction and just overall horror. The Abyss is attempting to destroy anything created by the Void, and the Void is trying to fill the area that is the Abyss, which is essentially all the other planes of existence as they've been crafted over time. Next up is the Aether. This is the realm of souls, where, again, your actual soul would be. Where void travel travels through the void in various different forms, as we'll see in a moment. Jump space and hyperspace both happen in the Aether. This is where, as I said, souls exist, and those souls are basically people as they're scattered across the entirety of the multiverse. A very short version of this is that if I were to flip a coin right now, my soul would be split into 2 parts. One that remains in the universe where it lands heads, one where it remains in the universe where it lands tails, but those souls are still me in part, just my soul on the material plane is a fragment of that with the full soul belonging in the Aether. The other big thing that this means is that the Aether essentially allows for multi-universe travel, so if you want to move through the multiverse, the Aether is how you do that. No one in the area of the known universe we're in now really can do multiverse travel, but it has happened every now and then, and it's a fun thing to mention. The Aether is also home to where demigods exist and angels are. Many other things live there too. It should be mentioned that I'm just covering sort of the biggest creatures that live here. There's lots of things within these realms. Next up, kind of opposite the Aether, is the Nether, the realm of death and those sorts of things. Death, disease, the fun parts of life, if you will, or the not so fun parts of life. It's where devils exist, devils being the opposite of demigods in this setting at least. So corrupted souls as opposed to elevated souls. It's also where dark gods or fallen gods live, those who came from the Void, who turned against them in various different wars over time. The Nether, unlike the Abyss, is civilized. It has culture, beliefs, a society. People live there. When your soul dies, your soul fragment comes into the Nether and remains there until the entirety of your soul, i.e. all versions of you everywhere, have died, and then you can go from the Nether, you spend some time in there before working your way back up to heaven, or up to the Aether. However, in the Nether, when your soul fragment is there, you may choose instead to sign a deal with a devil to go back to the world to avenge something or other, turning you into a devil or a demon. These are both fairly common, not too impossible. There are gods trapped here as well. Yeah. The final plane is the material plane. This is the realm where our physical souls exist, our bodies are, the world outside of us, it's where spaceships and planets and all those good things exist. Warp travel happens here. It was the first plane discovered by humanity, given that I'm currently sitting in it recording this. The material plane, I think we can all generally get an understanding. You'll also notice, in this order here, this is the Witcher cosmology of the universe. There are other ones, Sith and Jedi take a different approach, but broadly similar. The general consensus, though, is that the material plane is a centralizing location where all the other planes of existence come in. I'm also just going to quickly remind people that the planes mentioned here are just the 5 largest planes. There are many demi-planes, intrum planes, planes people don't know exist, etc. Just these are the 5 that have been studied, discovered, and are well enough known now in the known universe to be widely distributed and talked about. Next up is various forms of faster-than-light travel, of which there are predominantly 6 we're going to discuss, as these are the major 6. They are, as listed here, void chance, drives, gates, warp drives, hyperdrives, and jump drives. The earliest form of FTL travel were void chants. These were initially discovered by priests and wizards, mages, etc. on Earth in the First Soul War. The first ship to ever see void chants used for faster-than-light travel was the United Federation of Earth starship the Deucalion on its mission to Mars, which was then called Verse, during the First Soul War. In simple terms, a void chant works by having a priest call upon the gods to tear a hole in reality, essentially send energy in, and the ship enters into that hole, and before the energy around it has time to destroy the ship, it then very quickly drops out, and it will have traveled some distance between. There's no clear breakdown of 1 meter in the void is equal to 100 meters in the material plane. It's various fractions based off of where you go. This is a lot of what early seers, navigators, astrogators, etc. were doing aboard ships. Today, the only people to really use void chants in any common way are the Deutschland ships. This is because they have laws, and it's a whole historic thing that they don't like using void drives. So instead, their ships are all crafted with chantries on board that allow them to always have at least 21, though normally they try and have more priests in there chanting at any given time hymns to Sigmar, so that way they can maintain a constant void bubble around the ship, allowing for faster-than-light travel. I should also just add, this is aboard all Deutschland military craft. Church ships are still maintained with a void drive. It's a fun little thing in the lore that the church doesn't actually have to deal with the issues that they've caused in society at times. Following after void chants, we have void drives. Void drives go by many names. Void drive is the one I'm going to use. It's the Federation term. If you were Versian, you'd probably call them an Alt-Noah drive, which is minorly different but not enough to worry about, or a Xiaoming spool drive. Essentially, all of these work off of the same theory, though, of how they function. And that is, store a large amount of energy in a capacitor on the ship, discharge it to tear a hole in reality into the void, and then fly into the void while the void drive sucks in energy, forming a bubble around the ship, converting the energy that it's taking in to be power to be put into the ship, with a fraction of it, known as the void rating of the engine, being used to power the actual drive that maintains the bubble, and the rest of it being used to move the ship forward in here. Today, void drives go up to V12 engines, or void 12 engines, which mean that roughly 1/12 of the energy the void drive can pull in from the bubble around it is needed to maintain that bubble. The rest of it can be used to go into the engines, plasma thrusters, ion thrusters, etc., allowing the ship to gain much higher speeds and travel very quickly in the void. Void drives are extremely quick. They are the fastest form of travel besides void gates, and are the most common form of faster-than-light travel that you see in most of the known universe, but they do have a very high energy requirement, as mentioned before. For void drives, it's roughly crossing 12 parsecs, or about a sector, about a subsector, if not a bit more, in anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, with the absolute minimum time that a parsec can move, or that a void drive can move, being roughly 1 parsec per 1 to 4 hours, or 1 system and traveler per 1 to 4 hours. That would be a V1 drive. However, void drives, while very important and have existed for a long time, they were soon not replaced, but expanded on by Anakin Skywalker after the collapse of the First Terran Empire, who constructed the first Void Gate. These wouldn't really become widespread until the third and fourth space ages, but at least here, they were introduced in the second or third age and saw some widespread acceptance. Generally, what happened was Emperor Palpatine, died, and then Darth Vader gave the orders to split the Empire, with those in the northern area going to what will become the First Order, and telling pretty much everyone else to head to the galactic southeast of the Milky Way, where he was planning on going, and was then going to construct the Void Gate there. It was based off of an idea he'd come up with about 2 decades earlier, wherein you create 2 large void generators and then form a wormhole through the void with them, allowing for an extremely fast speed of travel, going so far as to allow one to travel between neighboring galaxies in as low as 6 months up to about 24 months today. Most of these transgalactic travel happens aboard massive ships known as voidliners, which tend to be hundreds if not thousands of kilometer-long barges designed to carry, once again, anywhere from tens to thousands of smaller ships, cargo, data spools, anything they can carry to cross between galaxies, they do. You can think of these like massive shipping ships today having to travel through places like the Panama Canal. Next up, after void drives, we come to the only major faster-than-light travel that exists in the material plane, and that is warp drives. They are used generally for traveling between 2 neighboring systems, given that in that period they take about 1d6, so 1 to 6 days, on average about 5 to cross between neighboring systems. The issue is they're slower than void drives, but they have a much, much lower power requirement. They don't have a risk of demonic or demon invasion. They don't have a risk of gods smiting your ship, the void bubble collapsing, souls entering you, you seeing flashes of the future or the past. All the issues with void travel can be ignored with a warp drive, though you do have a higher increased chance of piracy. This is negated in major empires through strong, basically, fleets of patrol ships, but it is still an issue, especially when you get to the outer rim where warp drives are very popular. Generally speaking, warp drives have the largest sale among traders in outer rim regions, as I said. This is because warp drives tend to be very low cost. They can fit in small, simple ships. They're fairly power inexpensive compared to a void drive. And yeah, warp drives generally have some positives, but they've lately been falling out of favor compared to hyperdrives and jump drives. They also generally, in places like the Federation, have a lower insurance requirement. Next up are hyperdrives. These are an innovation that came out of the Deutschland when they showed up in the Berlinic Galaxy. They're are Sigmar's blessed alternative to jumping through void space, the god's realm, without the god's permission, which is why they claim you need a chant to go in there. They work instead by creating a wormhole through the aether, similar to void gates, but instead of the gate creating the tunnel, it is the drive itself maintaining a preset tunnel or path through the void. They were initially discovered by Deutschland, and then refined and mass-produced especially by the Xiaoming megacorporation, but the largest purchaser of them was the First Order, who used them in the United Federation of Earth when they wanted to take over. Hyperdrives also require access to a hyperspace node, which has access to hyperspace routing computers, knowledge of other nearby nodes, etc., for plotting out jumps, etc. These high upfront infrastructure costs mean that hyperdrives, especially due to their relative newness, aren't very widespread. They're common in Deutschland, Germasha. They're starting to develop in First. They're very popular in the Xiaoming and the First Order, and extremely popular in the Federation recently, but in the Federation dominions, they're much, much smaller. Most of the time, though, essentially the upfront cost just mean that places like the Suki Corridor don't see them. The greatest advantage of hyperdrives is that they are fast. They allow you to travel between neighboring systems in a couple of hours, 1d6 hours between 2 neighboring systems. Add an extra d6 for every 6 parsecs you want to travel. It's a good system for getting around quickly. Finally, the last type of hyperspace faster-than-light travel we'll discuss here is the jump drives. These are similar and highly inspired by hyperdrives, but were refined by Xiaoming to allow for much smaller jumps and not require a navicomputer or anything like that. Instead, though, they do require an astrogator to have some idea of what they're doing. It's essentially a 6 parsec maximum, so you can jump 6 systems away from you, and takes exactly 1 week while you're in that space, regardless of how far you want to go. They're extremely, extremely new technology, though. They came about in the middle of the Great War when Xiaoming needed a way to quickly deploy the Kuro suits from their dropships, and they were popularized in the Suki Corridor especially after nations showed up and realized we can't just give void drives to all of these people, but jump drives should be okay. This has made them cause a bit of a trade boom, especially in the Federation dominions, but throughout any nation that has strong holdings in the Berlinic Galaxy. Again, much like a hyperdrive, it creates a temporary bubble in the aether, though instead of traveling through a set corridor, it just travels a set time, and uses that time depending on distance and a few other things. Next up is the speed of information in the setting. There are various types of faster-than-light travel, and there are various ways to send messages outside of just faster-than-light travel, but this all still has an effect on the way information speed is handled. I've just put here sort of a short summary of each of the major types of communication styles, and I'm going to discuss them just a little bit more in depth, but really this could be a dedicated video in and of itself, as could every topic in here if I'm being honest. Void graphs are the earliest and most common form of communication in this way. They're similar to telegraphs in that they can send and receive essentially pure, almost text, and that's how they're generally used, and require a dedicated void graph station. As well, they're generally used as repeaters between different systems. This is a service you can find at most Class A or B starports, even within the Suki Corridor. It requires a fair bit of power, but because you're sending pure text through the void, it's not that bad and relatively common. Much less common are void lines, which only really appear at Class A starports, but much like a real-world landline, can carry actual sound, not just bips and beeps of, true-false like a telegraph does. The largest advantage, again, besides pure sound, is that it's audio, but they're very restricted, even if they are available at Class A starports. You may see them anywhere, even so far as Class C starports, but if they're at a Class C starport, it's purely for absolute emergencies due to a high power requirement, whereas at a Class A starport, it may be used more regularly for, say, a weekly or possibly even daily check-in with their command station, though it's unlikely to have citizen access. If you want citizen access, you're looking much more to a void comm. These are designed to send both verbal and audio components, and are very akin to a flip phone or early cell phone, if you will, for sending long-distance cross-space messages. It should be noted, stuff like modern cell phones exist for intra-system travel. If you're inside of your galaxies, if you're inside of your system, you're probably using SAT, laser comms, all those sorts of things for instant communication far beyond even what we can know, where you can just deep beam your emotions into people's minds. That takes a lot of work and energy, though, so pure text through voidcom or pure audio through voidcom is much more common. Generally, these work like old switchboards did, so you may have a bunch of people signing into a single system that then switchboards out to others, but that's not too common. Even in the Suki Corridor, you'll find these at high-tech Class A starports, and that's about it. So you may want to check around the map for those if you need to do something important like that. Another relatively new innovation that's come about is the VoidNet. This operates now akin to our early internet, what we would have had in the late 70s, early 80s, i.e. BBS systems, ARPANET, DARPANET, all those fun things. It allows for a very slow but interconnected web of neighboring systems to share information. In places like the Milky Way, this does mean that theoretically at least, you could be somewhere on the northeastern quadrant of the galaxy and be sending a message down to the southwestern quadrant of the galaxy. It may take weeks to hit there, but it will travel through the void now without ever having to hit a ship to do this. These can carry anything from, pure text, pure audio, to, if you're willing to compress it and wait forever, you could send emotions right through the VoidNet. Finally, the most common and most used, and it's never gone away no matter how much people try and kill it, form of communication is mail. If you don't want to send your message in as a electrical frequency through the realm of either gods or souls, maybe just throwing a piece of paper you wrote some stuff on a ship that's limited to a warp drive is more your style. Or even just a ship with a void drive. As well, these ships are fairly common. They're stuff like jump boats and tramp freighters and long-haul cargo ships that fill basically the entire spectrum. So your main planet may have a jump boat, that connects into a major network that eventually hits long-haul cargo ships that can pull it to another galaxy if you want. Or if you're at the edge of a galaxy, you may need to toss it on a tramp freighter to get it somewhere that has jump boats to get it somewhere that can get to a cargo ship, vice versa. The next topic for discussion, Void Blades. Void Blades have no set color. They're very much like lightsabers from Star Wars. You can have whatever color you want. Colors, unlike Star Wars, don't really mean much. They're up to the user to dictate how they want to form the energy to create the color for it, generally. But yeah, they're basically lightsabers from Star Wars. The first versions of the Void Blade that were developed are the Jedi variant. This was created basically as soon as the idea of how Void Blades should work came into existence. And when Void powers were first discovered, basically right after the Augment War, during it even. At its most simple level, it is taking a stick, whether made of wood or metal or something else, and then deciding to run void power through it to create a solid beam of void energy. This was very basic. The Jedi and Sith have since refined this concept greatly, but a key piece of their Void Blades, at least, is that they are always going to be powered by someone dedicating magic to them, versus something like the Versian variant, which doesn't require void power to use, and instead has an aluminium crystal filled with void energy shoved in the hilt of it. That way, any person who wants to can walk around, grab a blade, flick it on, and start attacking people. There is an exception for this for the Equiteus or Dynastiorum, but that's not really relevant for what we're discussing in this point here. The Witchers are sort of an in-between of Verse and the Jedi. Their blades are handcrafted and tend to be more focused on actually being the user putting power into the blade and doing the thing, but they are also normally with an aluminium crystal in there to act as essentially a power source for the Witcher to draw on. Unlike a Versian blade, which itself pulls the power, a Witcher blade uses the person as a conduit to send the power. It's a minor distinction, but it has some relevance, the most large one being that Witcher blades are cursed because of this. If you're not the person who's put the energy in the crystal, when you're using the blade to activate it by sending it through there, you receive a curse. Some of my players will have known this and experienced the downside of this. For those of you who haven't, it's a very fun thing to deal with. There's also, just for sort of mention here, the Xiaoming Blade Pack. This isn't the only system like this, but it's the most famous and most prominent one to this day. And it's essentially an attempt to make a generic, off-the-shelf Void Blade that anyone could pick up that isn't just the Versian variant, but also something that has a more military approach. Something you could put on a Kuro Makuro, which is essentially a big-ass mech suit, or carry on a personal infantryman. Their attempt to approach this was to create an array of aluminium crystals and use those to power the beam. It actually worked moderately well as a melee weapon, but the great part that they found with it was using it for firing shots of void beam energy. This has had some very negative impacts, but it did work and it is still used today. They saw a great rise of use in the Great War, and they're most commonly now seen on Kuro Makuro suits as the primary power source. Whew. Next up is artificial intelligence. AI is a complicated subject in this setting, mostly because I'm partially lazy, but also because AI is just a lot of fun and there's a lot of horror around that. However, general purpose artificial intelligence is banned. There is no way in the current known universe that you are legally allowed to make a fully intelligent, fully sentient, fully custom robot by law. The two largest reasons for this are the one written here, the Third AI War, and the Witcher-led campaign that robots can't have souls. This has led rise to some of the things that the Third AI War would come out of, but I'm not going to get too deep into that because AI Wars and all that could be their own video themselves. The Third AI War, however, was a war between the United Federation of Earth and their Autolin-designed robots, an evolution of earlier AI war machines that they created. The latest generations of which allowed for a mesh network of almost fully sentient creatures. Essentially, one single Autolin couldn't be intelligent on its own, but if you shoved 1,000 of them together, the meshed computing resources would eventually achieve sentience. They were fighting against the Jermushan Cybermen. These were essentially Jermushan robotic skeletons that they'd put inside of power armor. It was a fun time for them, in part. Not really. They were, yeah, mech suit powered skeletons. Just a fun little note here as well. The mech suits they actually put the robotic skeletons into for the Cybermen, they would actually form the same foundation as the Sigmarine armor today does. So it's fun that the greatest enemy of Deutschland and Germusha also happens to be one of the greatest inspirations for their suits of armor. However, the end result of the actual war, which was between the two robot forces, not the actual humans supporting them, there were some with the Kriegsarum, that's not too relevant though, was that the Zalyns formed by working together. The Zalyns signed a peace treaty with the other groups, being promised nationhood within the galaxy, if no one else would develop AI that could do this. Essentially, the short form of it is that the Cybermen and the Autolins were hacking each other so much and realized each other achieved sentience that they just decided to set aside their differences in part and work together to work toward discovering what that sentience meant. As a result of the peace treaty, human nations in the Axian Alliance, the sort of major governing body of its day, were required not to use any artificial intelligence that was fully sentient. As I said, ban the creation of it. However, the AI wars, like our own Crusades, weren't stopped after the third one. It's just when people mostly stopped paying attention, and the Zalyns will continued to exist and continue to do things to this day, even in a very minor form. There's also other forms of AI that are completely legal. As it says, not all AI was banned, only really general purpose sentience-finding AI. There were limits put on the form of robotics as well. These are things like restraining bolts from Star Wars, if you will, basically ways to reduce their intelligence and form them into functionally slaves, if you will. Most AI today function as deeply interconnected multi-generational neural nets. They skirt the absolute line of sentience, but technically cheated out because none of them are technically one fully sentient network. So what this means in practice is that you may have a network of an AI dedicated to handling the leg processors who receives commands from a different network whose job it is to motivate moving the machine, who receives inputs from the visual network, who receive inputs from like a thinking. It's a massive mess of complications that really is just intelligence, but they pretend it isn't for all intents and purposes. It should be noted as well, this myth is highly propagated by the Transgalactic Empire. Next up is the types of fuel discussed in the setting. There are several different types of fuel, each of which is sort of tied to its own nation in part, but not entirely. As you can see on screen here, we have a fair number of them written out. There are others, and most nations do have some degree of cross-compatibility. Most nations can use power from one group or another, or have converters. It's not unheard of. It's just these are what they prefer and favor. Starting off with, we have aluminium, a crystal that was discovered on Mars and is capable of actually holding, maintaining, and storing void energy, as in you can put void energy in there and draw it back out again. These are used to power Aldnoah drives on Versian ships. Versian void blades, most Versian technology is just powered by aluminium. It is their lifeblood, their heart, their true form, etc. Dilithium is most commonly used in the Federation, United Federation of Earth. It wasn't discovered until several centuries after aluminium, and until then the Federation relied heavily on Tilium. Dilithium itself is essentially compressed dilithium into dilithium crystals, dilithium being a liquid kind of akin to oil, but there's harder bits in it. When you compress it down, you get dilithium crystals out of what remains. These aren't actually able themselves to produce power, but they're able to massively amplify the power run through them. So you could take a AA battery and power a Tesla off of it with a small dilithium crystal, for example. Tilium, on the other hand, is most commonly used and associated with Germusha, even though it actually today is more used by the Deutschland Empire and their friends. It's most akin to what we'd think of as oil. Liquid hydrogen and gas are slightly similar, but Tilium is the closest. However, Tilium's largest difference model is that it has the energy output equal to that of a nuclear reactor without any of the radiation risks. So it's a hugely beneficial fuel for powering massive, massive starships. It was first discovered on Verse by the person who would become known as Sigmar and found Germusha. But its largest reserve was famously on Pluto, in the Milky Way at least, and would be the foundation of where Sigmar would actually go take his people out, using it to build his own nation that would become Dramisha. The Empire, for a complicated set of reasons, didn't like dilithium and decided to adopt what they used to power their void blades, kind of taking a hint from the Versians. And that is kyber crystals. Instead of dilithium crystals, these actually contain energy, however. Unlike the dilithium... as time went on, the Empire came to use dilithium or kyber crystals to power basically everything, including their fleets. How do I explain this? Basically, the Empire was dilithium dependent, in part as a response to the Empire taking over. The Federation blew up a lot of their dilithium mines idiotically, in my opinion. The Empire resorted to going to use kyber, and then they discovered the biggest part of kyber. Kyber is created as a result of unnatural void events and possibly even abyssal events, and contain pure unaltered void energy in them. Essentially, if aluminium can have void energy stored into it, kyber is an aluminium crystal with the void energy already in it. Another major common form of fuel is liquid hydrogen. It's literally everywhere. It's extremely cheap. It's extremely common. Most of the time it's only really used by small traders out on the rim, though. It's pretty clean and low maintenance, but it does have issues with FTL travel. It can't generate enough power to sustain a void drive for very long, essentially. It can't sustain most forms of faster than light travel outside of jump or hyperdrives, but because jump and hyperdrives have become so common these days, liquid hydrogen has seen a massive increase in use. Finally, there is the colloquial term gas. It doesn't actually have a set defined meaning, but it, generally speaking, is a dirty fuel similar to oil used in the absolute worst situations or by low-tech societies, and should be avoided as much as possible. But it does see a fair bit of use, especially in places like the islands. Next up is Universal Standard Time. UST is based on Federation Standard Time. Oops, there we go. Is based on Federation Standard Time. And Federation Standard Time is itself based off of Earth Standard Time as we know it. This is almost entirely because I am lazy. I know Earth time, and yeah, I'm lazy, and I do partially believe humans will continue to be lazy in the future. The location, however, for Universal Standard Time, I've shifted from Greenwich to Winnipeg, Manitoba, as that became the capital of the North American Union due to the Night Titan production facilities there during the Augment War, which were sort of the foundation of North America when it came back into the Third World War, and when what was left of the Western world united to form the United Federation of Earth. Winnipeg had an army of Night Titans they could use to defend themselves and kind of take command. It was a big stick diplomacy moment. The Galactic Coordinate System is used to make finding places easier and is standardized by the Universalis Confederation. You can see it written out here in various examples, but very simply it breaks down to planet, then system, then the parsec it's in, the subsector, the sector, the supersector, the megasector, the quadrant, and the galaxy. For those of you who are wondering what that actually means in practice, we play in the island's sector. So greater than you, there are supersectors, megasectors, quadrants, and galaxies. You can, see that in the location format bit on the bottom. I don't actually remember what this is pointing to. I think it's pointing to 3-1 would be somewhere in the northwestern islands in the top area. Top 3 rows, probably actually the capital of some system, somewhere in what was the Western Islands Commune. But that's fairly irrelevant. You can just get an example there. Generally speaking, you aren't dealing with these things here. You also can see we have the time format used for expressing dates and times if need be. Those are just there for people who want them. They're used in various documents when I'm writing, setting stuff, etc. So it's just important that you guys can reference them in my mind. Next up, the Suki Corridor. It's located in the Berlinic Galaxy. That may seem fairly simple, but it's where it is. It was first created by the Xiaoming-born Kuro-Makuro pilot, Suki Sarazawa. He worked for the Megacorp to help defend the Deutschland's western border. against the Federation and Ally invasion there. However, while serving what would become the Suki Corridor, Suki himself grew to very much dislike what the mega corporation was doing, what it was defending, who it was allying with, etc. And he convinced his fellow Kuro pilots that they could actually do more good if they started defending the people here and working with them. Including actually discovering a small empire of humans they'd found who had developed faster than light travel partially. And Suki and his friends and fellow pilots began going around recruiting everyone they could to grab ships, to take whatever they could and take this fight back, and they actually won. This ended in several different pacts and accords. Some of the larger ones, and most important ones at least, are the Pharaoh's Pact, which was signed by Suki and his rebels and essentially said that no one will actually fight in these regions and let these people grow. And then eventually the passage of the Suki Act in the Universalis Confederation, which set these strict limits imposed today on the Suki Corridor. These limits were imposed in the hopes that preventing the major nations from just colonizing this area, just immediately invading and doing everything they can here, should maybe cause the creation of fresh new ideas, fresh nations, etc. How well this has worked is debatable, if not outright laughed at in part. There are some regions in the more northern parts of the corridor that actually have achieved a high degree of independence away from major nations, but it's well known that for most of the smaller nations in here, the big players have their hands in all of it. Finally, taking a look at the galaxy maps, there are several galaxies here. You can see them listed along with the largest player in all of them. You'll notice this is why the Berlinic galaxy looks like this, as opposed to listing everything that's there. But that's besides the point too much. To briefly discuss this whole big map situation, also just to put this out there right away, there is a mistake in this map. Saldor, Takara, Maldeth, and Tahara here are all Federation controlled. They are not actually the whole galaxies. This is how Federation propaganda portrays them. In reality, Takara is the largest of the four in terms of colonization, and that really only spreads to about here. The Scorpienza line fucks with them, but it's a problem. I messed up when I was making the maps, and here they are represented. But they should be more akin to what you see with the Axios Galaxy, or especially a Salem, maybe the Twin Shadows. And then, of course, Berlinic up here. Going through the different galaxies, starting with the Milky Way, this is where the United Federations of Earth is formally, which is down here in the Sol system. However, most of this is actually officially controlled by the United Federation of Terra Nova, following a bunch of reforms that happened. The United Federation of Earth and Terra Nova, United Federation of Earth, specifically, holds Dominion status. This is something I talk about in another video, on the various three dwarf galaxies here that are around the Milky Way galaxy. You notice there's a fourth one, the Sheev dwarf galaxy here. This is where the First Order actually operates out of. They're famous for being here and basically just invading into the northeast of the Milky Way. Neighboring to this area here, there is the Reverse galaxy that was colonized by the United Reverse Lords, actually colonized by the Verse Empire under Reverse, and is now controlled by the United Reverse Lords, basically came out after the war. We're not going to talk about this too much in depth. Moving on next, there is their neighbor, the Palpatinius galaxy here, who you can see this is where Britannia currently is, and the Imperial Versian Federated Territories. At one point in time, these three galaxies here were all one nation, the Third Verse Empire. Today, as you can see, they're not one nation. On the other side of Reverse, we have the Elusia galaxy, where the remnant of the Fifth Verse Empire remains here. But they aren't exactly huge or powerful. They still have a large amount of sway, but they're definitely not what they once were. There's the Berlinic galaxy, which is a complicated mess in and of itself. It has the capital of the Transgalactic Empire, I believe, up here. The Deutschland over here. The largest player in this galaxy overall. The Germusha here. Polanskia, a Zhaoming colony. The United Federation of Earth. The URL, the Reverse Lords, and the Imperial Versian, and I don't think the IVFT has holdings here, sorry. But the Universalis Confederation, you can see down here, which is Witcherland, Axian Alliance, UFE, the Empire itself. This is actually the official capital of the Empire, something I'll talk more about in a little bit. But yeah, you can see that from breakdown here. You have the Axios Galaxy, which has the Axian Alliance and the Xiaoming Megacorporation's control. And finally, the Twin Shadows Galaxy, with the United Augmented Republic down here and their bits of control. Alright, so that is the end of the first episode here, or the first part of the first episode. In the second part of this episode, we're going to be looking at a summary of a good chunk of the nations. Specifically, we're going to look at everything up to the Deutschland and the Germanian Republic, the Deutschland Empire, these fun areas here. We're going to save for part 3, and then part 4 is going to be looking at the timeline. But again, in the next part, we're going to take a look at all these different nations there and bits about them. Not in any depth, but just a bit of facts and tidbits about them, about 4 for each or so, if you will. Alright, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully you watched the next one and had a good time.